Francois, have you seen the series Jack Reacher?
No, I have not.
Let me tell you about it. It's a series we're watching at the moment. We're currently with season 2. And in this series, there's this guy called Jack Reacher, and he's absolutely humongous. He's a giant of a man. I think he's something like 6'6", 6'7", something like that. But it's not just about his height. He is huge. He's got these broad shoulders. He's not fat. I mean, when he takes off his shirt, it's just muscles all over the place. Now, here's why I'm telling you about Jack Reacher. When that guy walks into a room, heads turn. I mean, he doesn't even have to walk into a room. If he walks down the street, you literally see people turning their heads and looking at him. What is it that gives somebody presence?
Sure.
Intentionality with Paul Kempff, for people who lead with intention and live with impact.
I'm going to start by dropping a one-liner. Presence without substance means nothing. So if you, from a physical perspective, can draw attention, that attention is going to last a few seconds, but it doesn't have the impact that I believe we'll be speaking about today, what real presence is. There's character. There's being able to back it up with competence, with ability, with knowledge, with skills. I think all of that combined together, your attitude, your mindset, your energy, I think all of that together gives substance and gives that presence that we're going to be speaking about.
Okay, that's a great start. Today, in our Masterclass episode 4 with Francois
and Paul,
we're going to be delving into the soul and science of presence. What it means to have presence, what it means to own the room.
Yes.
Francois, let's maybe start with this question. Do you think you're born with presence, or do you think it's something that you can learn?
I think we have some good news for the audience. And again, my perspective, my opinion.
Well, you're the expert on these things.
Well, I do not believe that you are born with it. I believe that it is absolutely a skill that one can master. And the beauty of this is it's a multidimensional skill. It's got to do with physical appearance, how you dress, how you sit, how you act, how you show up, how you walk, how you talk. But it's as much got to do with your mind, how you think about yourself, how you think about the room that you're walking into, your preparation going into whatever it is, a meeting, a conversation, a dinner, braaiing with friends. There's so many memes and things that come up on my Instagram around how to own the room or how to be the most impressive person in the room. And then when you read deeper, there are recipes and tips and ways to do this. So yeah, without speaking too much about it right now, I'm sure we're going to get into it, but definitely not born with it. A skill that you can learn on various dimensions.
Okay, but those are some of the things we're going to be doing for the viewers and listeners today. We're going to be talking about tips, things that you can do to improve your presence, to own the room better. But before we get there, let's just start with this whole thing of born with it versus learning presence. Would you agree with me at the very least that some people are born with a natural baseline that is higher than the rest? Yes. Some people are just more expressive, have more extroversion, more confidence naturally from a very early age than other people, which would make it easier to have a presence.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think, for the listeners listening who aren't yet sure exactly what we're talking about, right? So have you ever been in a room where someone walks in and you just notice them? Or have you ever walked out of a meeting and you just remember this one individual more than you do the others? Have you ever felt inspired by a human around you? Like all of those are little hints around there's this presence. Before I go into the born, another cool story. So there was once a presidential sitting. And there was an announcer announcing the presidents, and the presidents one by one came from behind the curtain. They walked up on the stage and the audience clapped and they could see all the presidents. And then the announcer, the MC of this event, said the next president to welcome is the famous Nelson Mandela, right? And what was fascinating about this clip is Nelson then didn't come from behind the stage, from behind the curtain. He made his way from the back of the entrance where all the guests walked in. He didn't make a sound. He didn't say hello in his famous voice. And probably within 3 or 4 seconds, the entire hall, Paul, turned around and all faced and looked at Mandela coming in. And that's that incredible presence that we're talking about. So back to your question.
Just before you say that, I
Yes.
started smiling the moment you started telling the story, because somehow I immediately knew you're going to reference Nelson Mandela. Because if you talk about something like presence, I don't think there's a lot of better examples than that.
Absolutely.
I want to touch on one other example, and then we can go back to where you wanted to go to. I think begrudgingly, I have to admit that somebody like Donald Trump also has a presence. But just think for a moment about the difference in the presence of a Donald Trump, who has a very impressive presence to him, and the presence of a Nelson Mandela.
Yes.
There's something different there.
You know, without thinking twice, one word comes to mind, and that's humility, dignity. All right? I'm sure we're going to unpack that. Roger Federer, another one that comes to mind for me. I have said this on the masterclass, I think episode 2, I'm a big tennis fan. Tiger Woods, Rory McIlroy, many sports stars, Rafa Nadal. If you go and look at them, there are traits, and now I'm answering your question, there are inherent traits that kind of form a golden thread. Now, from a behavioral and a psychological perspective, we are all born with a personality. And so a personality has got traits, behavioral indicators, characteristics associated with a human being that is highly correlated with energy. So some elements in the personality come more natural to some people. Therefore, they display that behavior more because it gives them energy. Let's take a silly example. Teamwork. Everybody in the world understands the concept of teamwork. Some individuals prefer to work in teams and some don't. Why? Well, there are various reasons, but at the core of it, it starts with your behavioral inclination, where you get your energy. Do I get energy from being around people, or do people drain my energy? So you mentioned extroversion. You mentioned inherent confidence. You mentioned the ability to speak eloquently.
Emotional expressiveness.
Emotional expressiveness, emotional intelligence, small social cues like listening skills, social awareness, being able to pick up the energy in the room. Yeah. These are all ingredients that sit in the personality that, by the way, can be developed, hence the world of self-awareness, introspection, and coaching. But we have a baseline. And mine might be on an 8 and yours on a 3 or a 2 in some of these domains, and that could positively correlate with presence.
You're speaking of teams a lot, sports teams. Would I be right in saying that a lot of the impressive captains of sports teams that have reached the pinnacle of their sports, for example, our rugby teams, if we think about some of our captains, a Sia Khaleesi, a John Smith,
Francois
Pienaar, they all had presence.
Yeah. You know what's interesting about that? Is it not perhaps the fact that they already had the presence that got them to captain, as opposed to becoming captain and then getting a presence?
Absolutely. No, for sure.
Yeah.
And it's often one of those things where I think not just on a national level, if it comes to a school level, a lot of time a captain is chosen by the teammates. Yeah. And it's often the guy that probably has the most presence initially.
Yeah, and then we often hear this word, you demand it. You demand the presence. And then when you speak to these individuals and you ask them, like really, really to the core, are you purposefully doing this? And I'd love to hear the ratio around the yes and the no in that answer, because I haven't asked that question, but I think some individuals don't even notice that they've got it. They're that stronger in the personality, the inherent human. But then back to the question around being able to develop it, I think someone might be vulnerable and authentic enough to say, you know what, I'm crafting this skill. And so, yes, it is on purpose, and it's working, which is a phenomenal skill to have.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of the coaching and the learning, I did some research around this topic, and I found that at Harvard, they actually teach a course on executive presence. So they've got a formula, and I want to quickly give you that formula and just hear what you're thinking about. This is something that comes out of a Harvard Business Review article where they say presence equals gravitas, plus communication, plus appearance, plus authenticity.
Sure.
So 4 words: gravitas, communication, appearance, and authenticity. The gravitas I can understand. That's just, I think, a very nice word for presence, for having a certain aura around you, confidence. Communication, obviously, presence is much easier when you are eloquent, when you speak well. Appearance, we've spoken about the big guy in this TV series, but I think the way you dress, the way you groom, all of those things has an influence on your presence.
Yeah.
But why do you think they bring in authenticity?
I love that you asked that. I think I'll just quickly, but before I answer that, I think the first one, gravitas, which immediately came to mind for me, is being grounded. Now, I don't know if there's a correlation between the two English words, but that is what triggered in my mind when you said gravitas, is am I grounded? And the grounded links for me with the authenticity. Am I confident? Do I have the inner confidence to be authentically who I want to be and not be a poser, not be a chameleon changing who I am in every single context to suit or impress or to gain likes from the surroundings that I'm in? Am I comfortable in being who I am wherever I am? And that inherently comes from the inside, right? Which is then heavily linked, in my opinion, to the mindset, how you think about yourself, the self-confidence that we spoke about earlier in the conversation, and then the proactive nature around how you want to show up. The appearance side of it often gets overlooked. And it's seldom that you find sports stars on billboards who have a presence that aren't well groomed. You know, you don't have to be a model, but they're well groomed. Now, whether they do this by themselves or the advertising agencies paying them bills, the Adidas, the Calvin Klein, the whatever perfume brands do this for them, they understand from a human psychology and a consumer perspective, an observation perspective, that coming across in a way that is perceived to be respected shows something around your presence and what, again, you think about yourself. So a lot of this circles back for me around, I don't think you can have a presence if you don't believe and feel that by yourself first.
But that's also why I think authenticity is just one of the words that to me sums up what presence means.
Yeah.
It's about integrity. It's about having the knowledge and the experience to back up the physical presence you have with not just an emotional presence, but also a mental presence, or almost the whole package.
Yeah.
And I think presence to me is about bringing the whole package to the room, to the table, to the encounter, to the event.
Paul, I'll never forget when I met you many, many years ago. It was in a coffee shop. I got home and I told my wife, Ilana, oh my word, I've yet met, seldomly in my life, I've met someone with that I used the exact words, executive presence. And at the time, I didn't double click or unpack the why. It was just there. I felt it. I could feel it before you even spoke, and then as we were talking. And, you know, I'm not going to lie, it was quite intimidating, you know. And then I got to know you, and I know you've spoken about seriousness and humor, and we've spoken about your word of the year.
And I've gotten a bit better in terms of the serious.
Yes,
a little bit.
A little bit. But let's then unpack your definition in relation to yourself.
Yeah.
And how would you then rate yourself on those 4 domains? Because whether it's just my encounter or the fact that you're our captain on the golf tours, you can demand 32 mature men on a golf tour to listen to you, to pay money into a bank account, to, you know, everything that's needed with a massive golf tour that we go on. You're able to get 32 people to respond. You're able to get 200 people at FFG to respond to you. Like, you do have it. Do you believe that this definition then correlates with Paul?
I think it does. Obviously, communication, big part of it. It's something that I've had to work on a lot over the last 20 years to become a better communicator. You know, an interesting thing, when I started working at FFG in 2005, more than one person described me as somebody that was not a good communicator, somebody that was very closed. And it was something that I had to develop over time. Appearance, very important one.
Thanks, Chanel.
Before I met Chanel, thank you. Yes. Before I met Chanel, there was clearly something wrong with my appearance.
Yeah.
But that was largely due to the fact that I didn't have a great taste in clothing. I'm a little bit colorblind. So a lot of mistakes were made on appearance, but at least Chanel helped with that. But I think the authenticity part is the important one for me, because that's the part that I think doesn't just demand presence, or commands presence, but demands respect.
Yes.
And it's the respect part that I think if you can bring that into your presence, just because you you pitch up in authenticity, in integrity. That's the part that really works.
Spot on. You know, another word that beautifully talks to that element is character, and inside that, your character model as a human can be vastly different, and it can be influenced by many aspects: religion, family, values, life orientation, worldview. I mean, I'm kind of name dropping some concepts that I believe the listeners will understand. But whatever that foundation is around what shapes and forms your character, you then bring in life experience. And a big part of that is mistakes, right? So you might be an arrogant arsehole at some point because you're overly confident in your ability. And I often see this. I mean, I've had to go through that journey as well, especially in my younger years. I've always been able to demand a room with my mouth. God gave me the gift of the gab, some people say. But if you can't back that up with knowledge, respect, character, then you're only able to impress a new individual once. And the second, third, fourth time, it's like you become transparent and people see through you. Yeah. And I think there's a major opportunity to work on the inside, on the character side of it. What keeps you grounded?
There's another word that you used in the introduction to this episode that I want us to explore a little bit further, that to me is an incredibly important part of presence. And that's the word energy. I listened to a podcast this week where somebody spoke about energy being the superpower of high achievers. And in this podcast, he talks about how successful people, high achievers, do things at a different pace. They bring a different energy to the table. Yeah. But here's the thing that bothers me about this thing a little bit. I have encountered people that bring a lot of energy to the table, but it's not necessarily the right kind of energy. Would you agree with me that somebody with presence can have positive and negative energy? And I don't want to just hone in on this one thing, but if I can just use the example again of a Nelson Mandela and a Donald Trump. And I know sometimes these things that we say could be dangerous.
Well, in one of your previous podcasts, you said you're going to start becoming dangerous now and talk about money, sex, Trump, politics, and all of it.
But if you think about it, I think a Nelson Mandela brought a lot of positive energy through his presence.
Yeah.
Whereas sometimes I get the feeling that with a Donald Trump, there's not necessarily a positive energy always. There's sometimes a negative energy as well. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, absolutely.
If you're enjoying this masterclass on presence, give us a like, consider subscribing, share the link with your friends, and leave us a comment.
Right, so there's an opportunity for us to elevate our own energy, our own frequency, so that we can influence the people around us, so that we can all have a presence. I think that's another nugget we need to leave the audience with. You are not privileged or not privileged if you do or don't have the presence that you're looking for. You can foster it, you can craft it, you can manifest it through certain practical tips and techniques.
Now, we're going to get to those practical tips and techniques now. I think it's time to get there. But just before we do that, I love this example you have given because I'm very intentional in my life, but even more so about things like goals, bucket lists, BAGs. It's something that I'm absolutely intentional, absolutely religious about. Now, I have these things that I list for myself. Things that I want to do better in my life. And one of the things that has been call it a goal if you want.
Yeah.
For me, for the last 15 years, I can tell this now for fact, for the last 15 years, I've always said that it is my intention that when I have an interaction with somebody, they need to leave that interaction feeling good about themselves.
Sure.
I don't always get it right. Sometimes you get into an interaction or an altercation or conflict or an argument.
It just doesn't happen.
Where it doesn't happen. But I think it's so important, if that's your intention, if you set that as a goal, before you go into any interaction, if you have it at the back of your mind as something that you want to do, I think that's one of the ways in which you can almost craft this positive energy that you want to bring to any interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the word I want to, that's the good news today, is you can. You're not going to always get it right. It's not going to always be the outcome that you want. Life does happen. Unfortunately, we are creatures of habit. And so from a neuro perspective, a neuropsychological perspective, there are certain neuro pathways in our brain that are just stronger. And so we are triggered easily, and so becoming aware of what your triggers are is a good way, but to start to change that behavior. But it inevitably will happen that someone can just trigger you and you had a different intention for the interaction, didn't turn out that way. But there is the good news that you can foster it.
Yeah. Okay, let's get to the tips and techniques.
Yeah.
If it's not something that comes naturally to you, what are some of the things that you can do to create a better presence? Now, the first one I want to talk about is body language.
Yeah.
Have you got some tips, some things that people can do to increase their presence through simply their body language?
Yes. I want to differ. So firstly, I think a cool way would be to work through the definition and then address those elements. If we believe that the definition is the one that we believe in, right? And I know appearance is one of it, physical presence. The one thing I definitely want to differentiate with is what we're going to be discussing in the appearance side of it is we're definitely not advocating for fakeness, because you can adopt a persona from a physical appearance perspective that is in contrast with the last part of the definition, which is the authentic side, right? So I just want to kind of caveat it is to say, whatever the tips and the techniques are that we're going to be sharing now, let's just say the foundation of this is the authentic, real me side, or even it doesn't have to be the me yet, but the me I want to become.
Okay, but hold on. I have to stop you here because I disagree.
All right.
And let's just unpack this.
Yeah.
What about faking it till you make it? So if I'm not a confident person, if I'm not a person that has presence, for instance, adopting a posture that exudes confidence doesn't come naturally. But that's what I want to be. I want to be more confident. I want to become more confident. What's wrong with adopting that posture, even if it is fake initially?
Nothing. And I think we're saying the same thing, but I'm glad you asked for clarification. If the end goal is authentic, then in the beginning, I'm going to have to put myself in positions, fake it, be uncomfortable, do stuff that does not come natural to me. But the intention is to get to a space that I am considering the authentic me I want to become. So we're saying the same thing.
Okay. Glad to hear that.
Yes. Okay, what can you do? Well, have you seen someone sit back like this, shoulders open, a bit more relaxed, as opposed to slouching?
Yeah.
That's maybe
Closed
the first
off.
example. Yeah. Am I closed off? Am I open? There's a lot of research around body language and confidence and self-belief. Basically, identity. What you believe and think about yourself often gets portrayed by your physical appearance. So if I am open, I'm relaxed, shoulders are a bit drawn back, I am also inviting in because
Because you're open.
I'm open.
But isn't it about more than being open? What about making yourself big? So what I've heard is, and I'll try and demonstrate.
I'd love you to help me with this because I'm 173.
Okay. You don't need size to be present, but
Yeah.
we've said that already. And you've got a presence without having the size on your side. But what I mean by making yourself big is I'm going to try and demonstrate. Instead of sitting like this when you're in a meeting, something like this, you just appear a lot bigger when you do that.
Yeah.
And there's something about a presence in that, don't you think so?
Absolutely. I think part of having a presence is being noticed, right? So, oh my goodness, this just came to mind. I read a book at Varsity around this guy in America who figured this recipe around how to attract women,
Yeah.
right? I think it was called The Pickup Guy or something crazy, but I had a laugh in reading it. But one of the chapters was around how to dress and dress in a very silly way. And the only reason he did that is to stand out, is to be noticed. So I think definitely in the way you sit, how you walk, what you do with your arms, what you do with your hands, attracts attention. Yeah.
So there's something that I read, a piece of research that I want to get it right. So I'm going to just make sure that I've got the facts right. It comes from a TED talk of a person called Amy Cuddy.
Yeah.
She called this her power posing study, and it's a TED Talk she did in 2012. Now, this TED Talk had more than 27 million views. And in the TED Talk, she spoke about power poses. Now, I've just given an example. The closed off, making yourself small is like the opposite of a power pose. A power pose is the one where you put your hands behind your head, you open, spread out, you just look bigger. And it's the most fascinating thing. They did an actual scientific study where they took samples from people, they then made them pose like this, and then they took samples again. And it was crazy, the results of this. They found a 20% increase in the levels of testosterone in people.
Wow.
After simply sitting with a power pose for 2 minutes, and a decrease of 25% in cortisol.
Stress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Testosterone, the confidence hormone, cortisol, the stress hormone.
Wow.
Simply just a better pose, a power pose, a more powerful pose, actually had this physical effect on people.
Yeah.
It's a great TED Talk. You should go and watch it if you haven't seen it.
Yeah. You know, I can't help but think that by choosing how you want to appear, connecting that with the authentic vision of yourself has to have a correlation with your brain, your hormones, the chemicals, and therefore the frequency. And all of this then put together are signals of presence.
Agreed. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is eye contact. And this is an important one for me because it's one I struggle with. I believe in eye contact. I think you should look at somebody when you speak to them, and when they're speaking to you, you should look at you should still be looking at them. The problem is I often get people telling me that when I look at them with a lot of intentionality, it becomes intimidating.
Yes.
Where's the balance there? How do you get it right? How do you portray a presence by looking at somebody attentively without it becoming intimidating? I need help.
That's a good question. I think, Paul, eye contact is a form of respect, but I believe it goes both ways. So on that one hand, the ability to look someone in the eye says that I'm inviting you in to me, right? If I'm avoiding eye contact, often you see people avoiding eye contact, they have something to hide. They don't want to be vulnerable. They don't want to open themselves up. So firstly, by looking you in the eye, I'm okay for you to see me. I think that's the first part of it. That then, in my opinion, correlates with the gravitas and the character. That's part of the definition, that authenticity. Like, hey, I've got nothing to hide. This is me. Look at me. Where it becomes weird and intimidating is if the social cue is missed by the person receiving the eye contact when you become, let's take it, you're the person looking at me. If you can observe me becoming uncomfortable, give me a break.
Because it's too intense.
Give me a break by breaking the eye contact.
That's a good piece of advice.
Yeah.
I think I'm just thinking here that the other option is also that it's great to look at somebody with a lot of intent, but before it becomes too intense, try and put some warmth into the way you look at somebody. And the one way I can think of doing that is a smile.
Yeah.
There's a big difference in looking at somebody with a very serious face and the next moment you're smiling at them. I think that's also a break in that intensity in the eye contact.
Yeah.
All right, that's a good one. It's good advice. Thanks, Francois.
I think there's a second one, is when someone is speaking, people with presence don't interrupt.
That's the next one I wanted to get to. It's such an important one for me, and I'm sorry for interrupting you now. I just did it.
No.
But I think the way you talk says so much about your presence. First, the speed that you talk with, the control, the emotional control. If you calm in the situation, especially if it's a situation that becomes potentially a conflict situation where people start disagreeing, can you bring calmness to the conversation? I think that immediately creates gravitas and presence. But then the next important part, also let the other person speak. Never interrupt them the way that I've just interrupted you. And I think there's another element to it, and I've completely taken over the conversation around talking. But to me, there's an incredible presence to somebody that can make their point succinctly. And it's something that I find a lot these days. People struggle to make their point. You know, they go on and on and on about somebody, and I think it almost detracts from your presence.
Absolutely.
If you're not able to get to the point quickly.
Absolutely. And again, all of these things are interlinked. The ability to speak eloquently, to articulate a message without over-communicating, stems from an inner confidence that I know what I'm talking about. I can speak to this topic or domain. But then being authentically vulnerable to say, I don't know. Those few words are so powerful. A presence is not always having all the answers. Presence is not always being the smartest person in the room. Presence is not always being, let's take the American president that you brought up a couple of times today. Like, I've seldomly heard him not have an opinion on something. I've never heard him say sorry or apologize.
Or I don't know.
Or I don't know. And I think that's such a beautiful part of presence, is the authenticity to be able to go, I don't know. After an individual has asked you a question, looking and seeking an answer, I don't know. I can't help you.
I think all of this, everything, all these tips that we're giving is for me, perfectly summarized in the communication model of Albert Mehrabian.
Yeah.
You've probably heard it before, where they say that when you communicate, you must always remember that 55% of what you say is determined by body language, 38% is determined by your tone of voice, and only 7% about the words.
Yeah.
And when I hear that, I always think to myself, words count so little. Why do you want to use so many words? Making your point.
I wish I could add to that mathematical sum, because that gives us 100. But if we could go to 120, I would add an additional element. How did I make you feel? People don't often remember what you said. They hardly ever remember outcomes or decisions made, but they almost always remember how they felt, which is back to one of your 15-year intentional goals. Is, how did Francois feel after our interaction? And often I've seen that people with presence have that positive feeling effect, that vibe that we spoke about earlier, that they leave behind.
Francois, this was really great. I thoroughly enjoyed it as always. I think there's a lot of content in here. I certainly hope that our viewers and our listeners find some value in some of the tips and can help increase their presence. Yeah. I think it's important for us to leave everybody listening today with a challenge. I've got a very specific challenge that I want to give them.
Let's do it.
I really want to challenge everybody listening today that to make a point of, when you walk into a room, the next time you walk into a room, act as if it belongs to you. Now, again, that whole thing of fake it till you make it comes up again, but act as if you belong in that room, and see what shifts in the behavior of other people. Just try it. And do it more than once to see whether or not you can become better at this whole presence thing.
Yeah, and I want to add to that, if I may. It's not about dominating. I think we confuse that.
Yeah.
The bully needs to dominate. Presence is not that. Presence is the inner confidence that we've spoken about now at length around what one can do to demand attention for positive outcomes.
Is presence not a quiet confidence a lot of times?
Yes. It's an inner belief in my ability to contribute to the environment I'm in.
Yeah. This has been great. Francois, thanks a lot for your time.
Paul, as always, episode 4, done and dusted.
Done and dusted. Looking forward to the next one already.
100%.
And thanks everybody for listening.
Cheers.
Thanks for watching Intentionality with Paul Kempff. Like, subscribe, and click that bell to get notified when we release more episodes on how to live a life of intention and purpose. See you next time.